Patrick is passionate about business and governance. He's a 46-year-old Ugandan. Patrick, are you still 46? Who has served both.
I don't even know why you're unpacking them.
Who has served both in private and public sector roles. He's a lawyer by training. He graduated with a bachelor's degree from Makerere University in 1998. He holds a postgraduate diploma in legal practice from LDC in Kampala. He holds professional certificates in marketing and successfully completed the Executive Development Program of the Gordon Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria. His 20-year career began in the public sector, where he served the Ministry of Justice under the Capacity Building Project of the Uganda Law Reform Commission. He went on to join the private sector through Coca-Cola Subco, where he served for 9 years, living and working in different emerging markets in Africa and Asia. In 2009, he returned home to found and run a logistics business. He established and managed Mandit Logistics for 4.5 years, during which he found time to help establish the Kampala Capital City Authority, where he served for 8 months. In 2013, Patrick was headhunted and took on an assignment with Hima Cement, where he served for 4.5 years. Patrick, you'll tell us the secret with the 4.5 years in most sectors. So he served for 4.5 years in a dual role as general manager for Rwanda and sales director, regional business unit, Rwanda, Uganda, Eastern DRC, and South Sudan. And he helped achieve historical strong results. In mid-2016, he was again headhunted to serve in his current role, managing the turnaround of the largest private sector player in agroforestry in Uganda. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the New Forests Company, NFC, where he's the first Ugandan to serve in a role that had previously seen 8 leaders in 10 years. He's an INT alumnus of Class 2. He's happily married to Evelyn, his wife of 21 years, and they've been blessed with 5 children. They make their home in Entebbe, where they maintain a healthy lusuku with 4 German Shepherds. Help me virtually welcome Patrick. Patrick, you're welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for those warm words of welcome. And welcome as well to the new intending Oxids. When you join INT, I think your life begins to change. For some of you, this comes as a catalyst to accelerate what's already happening in your heart. I think for others, it will jumpstart a seed that you carry, but maybe needed some watering. At whatever stage you are, do not allow yourself to go through this process without critical self-evaluation, because INT will provide you the space of heart and mind to be able to do that. Just evaluate yourself carefully. Understand who you are. Understand what your passions are. Understand what you're called to. Something that may not be apparent to you, but I'm sure Harriet has covered it already. But just to emphasize, as INT, we come from a theistic worldview. So we are people who believe in God, not just a God, the living God. And our worldview is very Judeo-Christian. It's a biblical worldview. And everything we do, every thought we have, every burden that we carry, the thing that motivates us, the animus that motivates us, is that understanding that there is a commission and there is a calling on each and every one of you. And our role as facilitators is to help you unpack that, to help you begin to see it, begin to give language to it, and most importantly, to act. And so I welcome you warmly. I sat where you now sit many, many years ago, might have been 15 years ago, thereabouts, in the second class of INT. Like many of you, I was also invited into the class, and it's had a profound impact on my life, on my thinking, And in terms of just shaping my destiny, I'm a lot clearer. I'm a lot clearer because of the time I've spent at INT. This morning, my assignment is to introduce to you something that many of us don't think about a lot. But the moment you join INT, you have to begin thinking about everything. The day you join INT, the way you pick up the newspaper changes. The way you listen to the news changes. The way you engage in conversations changes because your lenses are beginning to change. And what we're going to do this morning is to begin to understand and remind ourselves, where have we come from? How is it that we find ourselves where we are? And we are going to zoom out. We're not going to focus on one small area. We're going to take a macro view of the whole continent and do a tour of the continent and ask ourselves some searching questions, which in subsequent lectures, you're going to be able to focus on in niche areas. Whether it's leadership ability, whether it's comparison with other countries, whether it's applicability of different texts, you'll be able to do that in subsequent lectures. This one is some sort of civics lesson wrapped in history with a healthy dose of questions. Questions that are for you, questions that are for me. What is it about us as a people? What is it that's about us as a people that defines us, that makes us do the things that we do? Are we happy with where we are? Are we not happy with where we are? And how do we move forward? Because if it's going to be, I think it was Mahatma Gandhi, not his daughter. It was Mahatma Gandhi who said, if it's going to be, it's up to you. Be the change, I think was his language. Be the change that you want to see. So we are charging you as potential oxides, as people who are committed to this process. Ask yourselves the hard questions. Get uncomfortable, and that's healthy. So our lecture, for those taking notes, the title is 60 Years of Africa Independence. Why 60? Because roughly, it's about that time, that's about that time frame from the time African states began to get independence. Our oldest state is Ghana, that got independence. Of course, there are those like Ethiopia who have a distinguished record of never having been colonized. But of the colonized states, Ghana was one of the earliest nations that got independence. And for most of us, we mark our time from around that same 10-year period when independence was achieved by the African states. And so we use that number loosely. Don't type in the chat room and say, no, it is 72. No, just work with me a little bit. So we're using it loosely to say it's roughly 60 years of Africa independence. What have we done? What have we achieved? If I can get this to move, let's see. Okay, there we go. Before we get into the meat of it, let's pause long enough to acknowledge a very critical book in our study of INT. Martin Meredith is the author. He's a British citizen. It is useful to add he is a white British citizen who spent many years as a journalist reporting in many parts of Africa. Notably, I think the Financial Times, and he did many publications. I don't remember all of them. But the thing about Martin, he's made a career out of examining Africa. He's written a number of books, and he's gone as far as exploring the last, I think it is 2,000 years of Africa. You know, he's done a lot of historical work with Africa. This was one of his earlier works, The State of Africa. And the reason we like it at INT is because he applies a political lens to this continent and asks the question, why? What is this history of this continent? This is around the 50-year mark when he did this. But the thing about this work, as you begin to dig into it, you will see that Martin is he doesn't hold back. He doesn't treat Africa with kid gloves. He's going to criticize where there's criticism. He's going to say things that will make you uncomfortable. But it's useful to get an outsider's perspective on the continent, even as you and I begin to engage and ask ourselves, are we doing well? Are we not doing well? So the book is State of Africa. Do not be intimidated by the size. One of the things that I am learning is it's very useful to have a consistent way of reading. If you're like me, the video, if it gets any more, because well. So the book is going to help a great deal. It's going to help a great deal. So when we come to this lecture, what we're trying to achieve here is to have an understanding of who are we as a people. I hope you can see that slide and see the different continents that can fit comfortably within the geographical spread of Africa. The United States of America, the whole of China, the whole of Western Europe, with all the drama that comes out of it. India, and you can even have space enough to fit in Argentina. Africa, as a geographic landmass, is significant. We are talking 30 million square kilometers. That's something that we don't always think about. It is a huge continent. It's a massive continent. And so in there is a lot of a diversity, is a lot of talent, is a lot of gifting, are people who are largely untapped as a force to contribute to humanity. And in a short while, we shall see why that statement can be made with fairness to our continent. Our outline this morning is how did Africa come to constitute, how did the nations of Africa come to exist the way they are? We shall cover, in the time we have, we shall cover part of it. Then we shall switch a bit and ask ourselves, what are those issues that worsened and hindered the synthesis of nationhood in Africa? Do not be intimidated by those words. Essentially, we are saying, why are we still struggling to be nations within Africa? Why is it that we think of ourselves first as tribes, as people groups? We don't think of ourselves as nations. Why is this a problem? Places are not for us. And we'll touch on it a little bit, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your own analysis of what's happening, because each of you has a very relevant experience that we want to tap into. The last thing we're going to do is focus on the Millennium Development Goals, or SDGs if you're up to date. These Sustainable Development Goals, and ask ourselves, if you put Africa on a scorecard, how will we perform? How are we doing? If you put all of us together, our history as nation states over the last 60 years, what does that report card do? If you're like me and you went to primary school somewhere in an urban center, at the end of term, usually you went back with a report card. And your parents sat down and looked at the report card. And if you belong to a household like mine, it made the difference between whether you're going to have a good day or a really, really lousy day. And that's what we're going to do for the continent as a class, and just challenge each other. Are these scorecards even relevant? Are they telling us a story, or are they not telling us a story? So that's our journey this morning. Let's get straight into it. Let's remind each other of the civics classes we did. For me, I think this was probably P5. I don't know if some of you were born or not. Please do not lift up your hand where you are. Triangular trade. We went through a time in the 18th century as a human race where Europe was advancing fairly rapidly. They were industrializing. The thing that you hear, that word industry, sounds like a very common word, but then it wasn't very common. Industry was a new concept, and Europe needed raw materials. They needed materials for their industries to succeed. And then they needed a market where they could sell what they were making. And that was how their economy was growing. What ended up happening was that Africa became prime hunting ground for the essential raw material to service the European industries. What's particularly interesting is that as that raw material grew, I'm talking about slaves, I'm talking about your ancestors and mine, as they began to take slaves, forced labor against your will, they would grab you and take you to some foreign land, force you to work and be productive for them at no pay, for the most part, no pay. What they called pay was essentially sustenance to keep you alive, to work more. This slave trade was quite complex. It wasn't very simple. They didn't just grab you from Africa and take you to Europe. No, the trade was such that it was most profitable if they moved the slaves from Africa to the plantations that they were developing in what they called the West Indies, in the Caribbean nations. They had massive plantations of sugar, the sugar cane. They had massive plantations. They had cotton plantations, and all these things needed to be farmed by somebody. The labor was freely available. Your ancestors and mine fought each other, sold each other, and eventually, for the most part, we lost out of this trade. That exported labor grew, planted, tended what became raw materials for the factories in Europe, where they would manufacture sugar, they would manufacture cotton. They went into all sorts of industries. They had social problems in Europe as well. They were tapping into youth. The children were being forced to work. If you were 11 and 12, you're considered an adult, and so on. But I think what is really relevant for us this morning is just how big a problem this was for our continent. Slaves were traded, and were traded aggressively. For those of you who are aggressive readers already, please don't try this if you're not yet there. I will recommend a book by a gentleman called Tipu Tipu. I'll share it with Kathy and Hope so they can share it with you. Tipu Tipu wrote an incredible account. He was a trader based in Zanzibar, and he was the most prolific slave trader in Africa. For him, he saw a business opportunity. Europe needed raw materials. To service the raw materials, they needed slaves. He put together the equation and he found himself a niche. His job was to tell the Europeans, do not worry, come to Mombasa and enjoy your cocktails. Give me a month. I will come back with the people you need. And he led caravan after caravan into the heartland of Africa, plundered and brought back to the coast slaves from the deep interior, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, all those areas, Congo, all of them felt the might. South Sudan, the most prolific, which means there were others. So there was no shortage of Africans willing to make a buck on the back of Africa's suffering. And I ask you today, has this trend changed or has it continued? Do we still have Africans working against Africa, or have we learned from our past? That's something for you to consider. Before 1948, those of you who are good historians will remember some interesting things that happened around 1948. No, I'm going to ask for some participation. Does anybody know what took place around this time? What global event took place just before 1948? Anyone, just open your mic and shout the answer. Or shall I pick? The name and the answer, please.
My name is Wycliffe, and I'm saying it was World War II.
World War, perfect. And who is saying this?
Wycliffe.
Yes,
Wonderful
but what
Wycliffe.
is your name? I'm looking for your first name.
Wonderful Wycliffe. My name is Wycliffe.
Wycliffe. Thank you very much, Wycliffe. That is the answer. Thank you very much. So the world, wonderful, wonderful Wycliffe. Thank you, wonderful Wycliffe. Very wonderful answer. This was around the time of the World War. Look at what's happening on the African continent. You see shades of color. Those colors represent something. Let's look at yellow, a color that I think will actually, if you're very particular, and I think the ladies are quite good at colors, they will tell us that is closer to mustard than yellow. But let's just work with yellow for now. Where you see Egypt, where you see Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Uganda, Kenya. That color over there, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but that color over there is land that was owned or controlled by the United Kingdom. It's the same for Nigeria, it's the same for South Africa, it's the same for the Gold Coast. The European powers was extremely good at dividing our continent and controlling it for their interests. Uganda, we were under the British. When I talk to my friends from French West Africa, they tell me we should count ourselves lucky that we're under the British. At least they prioritized education. Different people have different answers and different experiences that are quite amazing. The important thing is this: Africa was divided. Africa was controlled from outside. And the strategic interests of Africa did not exist. We only existed to service the interests of the Western powers. There is something that happened that brought us to that point. It didn't just occur in the mid-1940s, place much earlier, at the turn of the century. As a forefather on the continent, Kwame Nkrumah was one of those with a passion and a vision for what Africa could become. Many people say he was way ahead of his time. Kwame Nkrumah is quoted as having said that our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. That was his heart. That was his passion. That was what he lived for. Not many people live that way, but Kwame was one of them. And he was instrumental in organizing a fantastic conference in 1958 that essentially brought all the key participants from the continent. And Kwame's passion was, we need to be free. We cannot remain as we are under the colonial powers. It is high time Africa began to determine her own destiny. Who attended? Some very interesting names. Kwame himself was the convener, Julius Nyerere, Joshua Nkomo, Hastings Banda, and so on. And these were leaders drawn from across the continent. From across the continent. You had people from West Africa, you had representatives from Southern Africa, you had representatives from Eastern Africa, and there are names that I hope many of us can identify. In the East African region, I think interesting names like Patrice Lumumba should leap out at us. Tom Mboya would be a name that some of the older participants will remember from Kenya. These were what you would refer to as the fathers of the independence movement on the African continent. I'll follow the pattern set before and ask for somebody to identify this handsome young man. Did I see a Flavia in the class? No?
There's no Flavia, there's Florence, but I can't identify the face.
Okay,
Florence, I don't know the face.
What is Florence's other name? You know, she has a fantastic first name.
Florence is her first name, but the course name is Fantastic Flower.
Yes, that's the one I was looking for. That's the one I was looking for. I knew there was fantastic somewhere. Fantastic Florence.
Fantastic Flower cannot identify the face. It's not familiar.
Okay. Can anyone assist you? Pick on somebody in the class to assist you.
Wycliffe, you were good at these names. Please come to my rescue.
Wonderful, Wycliffe.
I'm here, Florence, laughing at myself. But this, this face looks like Patrice Lumumba. I just guess.
The man is wonderful. Please clap for him virtually. Patrice Lumumba, a key mover in the independence movement on the African continent, played a massive role in birthing Congo as a nation. And his story is one that is worth reflecting on. Follow the July 11th, Moise Shombe declared Katanga province independent. September 14th, Colonel Joseph Mobutu staged a military coup. That, in a nutshell, is the story of Congo. By the time they gained independence, Congo was set up for failure. It's a story that is repeated in many parts of Africa. But the reason I find this particular story so painful was the passion, the edge, the drive of Patrice Lumumba was one that should have yielded so much promise, but ended in his murder. As you research his history, you'll begin to see photos of his family, photos of his wife, and how the colonial powers went through so much trouble to make sure that nothing of Lumumba's line could ever resurrect again. The results, a very difficult Congo, the kind of Congo that you and I know today. Before we do this next slide, I'll just reflect a bit from my own experiences in Congo. One of the things I've done in this life is represented a cement company in Eastern Africa, mainly Uganda, Rwanda, and Congo. And in my work in Congo, I have sold high-grade cement to very big gold mines, some of the largest in the world. In terms of quality of gold, one of the best, maybe 2, maybe 3 in the world. Some people will say it's the best gold mine. But what is relevant for this class is that we are now in the late 2018, somewhere there. In 2018, I visited Congo on behalf of the company that I represented, and my job essentially was to secure a sales contract, ensure we agree on technical terms, and then deliver the product. My physical visit to this gold mine in the eastern part of Congo was one of the saddest events of my adult life. As you approach the mining compound, you encountered Congolese government troops. These troops were probably 3 deep, 4 deep, there were quite a few, and they manned the outside perimeter. The moment you were cleared to enter and you crossed the gate, you encountered white South African hired soldiers. I describe them as people as big as a fridge. It kind of gives you my background. I consider fridges very big things. Massive men who can sit and eat a goat on their own. These are not men to play with. Huge. These are the guards within the perimeter. Inside the compound is the size of, those of you who are in Kampala and familiar with Kampala, I am estimating the compound, that mining compound is the size of Bukoto. It's like a small city. It is huge. There are very few Congolese. Very few Congolese. I was there for 2 nights. I spent 3 days. I probably encountered 3 or 4 Congolese. I don't know where the rest were hiding. There were every nationalities. There were white South Africans, there were people from the UK, there were people from all over the world, and they had converged on this compound. They import their own food, they import their own water, they do not interact with the community, they mine this gold, they have built their own airport, the gold is moved onto the planes, there is no customs. It is managed by the mining company. They declare what they declare and they fly out to the gold markets of the world. I ask you today, what has changed in Africa? You cannot talk about our continent without reflecting on our population. please take a note of this website. And I think I'll request Harriet and the team if we can make these slides available to you, if you find them useful. But take a note of this particular website. This website will be extremely instructive to you to begin to give you an idea of the population demographic in Africa. Why is that important? The moment you join INT, one of the things that you're going to be pressed regularly to do is to think strategically. We are an extremely young continent. This is a very innovative tool. Go in there in your free time, enter your details, and see your place in the world, your place in Africa, your place in Uganda. You'll begin to appreciate what, as leaders on the African continent, we are dealing with. We are a very young continent with very young people, a lot of talent, amazing people. We are crying for good leadership. It's a deep cry. If any of you in this class is involved in establishing gold mining companies like the one I've just described, I will deny I ever met you. We must improve. We can be better. And this is an interesting tool that will help you in that process. We're going to switch gears now and ask ourselves some hard-hitting questions about our continent. Remember where we are coming from. We've done a broad sweep from the 1800s. We've touched on the 18th century itself. We've done a broad sweep right through to the Independence Day movements. But now, just before we get to the 2000s and beyond, we are doing a reflection and saying, how are we doing over the last 60 years? How are we doing in terms of our scorecard? How are we performing as a continent? In front of you is a graph. On the x-axis, 1990 through to 2018, it's the latest one that they've put out. I couldn't find anything beyond then. There's a really, really interesting and innovative group of people that work with data sets. Those of you who are interested, a lot of it is World Bank, but it's a website that is called Our World in Data or Our World in Figures. There are several. Statista, I think it is. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Is also a very good one. So there are several, but the important thing is the data they are working with is all centrally held. It's World Bank data, it's United Nations data, and all countries input their own data. So let's use it to identify trends more than to argue about accuracy. If you look at the trend, I think all I'll point out on this particular slide is the bottom part. What this graph is trying to do is to tell us how many people are living in extreme poverty in the world. Extreme poverty is defined as somebody who lives on less than $2 a day in purchasing power parity terms. Or if you want to absolute terms, it might even be less than $1 a day. I know they kind of raise it, but very little. If you look at the graph, we can start at the top because I think if we spend time on this graph, the next graphs will be easier to run through. So let's start at the very top. The dark green is Latin America. That particular dark green shade starts with a thick portion and it works its way down like a wedge. So the starting point in 1990 and the ending point in 2018, you will see that that line, the thickness of that line has decreased. That shows that Latin America as a continent has fewer people living in extreme poverty. That's the simple way to read this graph. So they repeat this. I will not spend time on East Asia and Pacific, but South Asia is a fascinating read, the yellow one. Have a look at that yellow color. Look at how wide it is in 1990, the number of poor people living in South Asia. Look at where they are in 2018. There are economists who tell us that in 1990, China had about 365 million people living in extreme poverty. 365 million people in extreme and abject poverty. By 2015, 3 years before the end of this graph, they had dropped that number to 60 million people. Now we ask ourselves, over this same period of time, what's happening in Africa? That's where we come to our color. The very last one, it's like a bluish color. Beige, I guess, is also a color that will fit there. We start off fairly thick in terms of how wide it is in 1990. By the time we get to 2018, we have grown by at least 40%. But this is not a graph that you want to grow, because all we are saying is that as time goes on, more and more people are living in extreme poverty. Ladies and gentlemen, these are World Bank numbers. These are numbers that our Ministry of Finance uses for planning. These are numbers that our Bureau of Statistics inputs into. World Bank does not generate them. It is a central repository where the countries bring the numbers. So by our own confession, by our own submission, we are saying we have more people living in abject poverty. Is that a good report card? But hold your judgment, there is more. In front of you is primary school enrollment. And again, we're trying to take measures that can compare Africa as a continent with the rest of the world. And we're trying to gauge and say, in these 60 years of self-determination, have we made progress? Ideally, each graph should be 60 years long. The reality of accurate data is that you have to work with shorter time frames. But like I said earlier, it is useful for trends. That means it's just indicating the general direction. Look at this one, primary school enrollment. OECD member states, those are countries that are generally middle to high income countries. They are generally very well represented. Their enrollment of primary school is 100%. They are high above that. European Union, same story. Sub-Saharan Africa, look at where we started. In 1970, only half our children were enrolling in primary school. By 2015, our leaders had grown that number to over 95%. Now that's a good graph. It shows progress. It shows work. It shows that there was policy and implementation that delivered a future. So that is great. I really like this slide. It means more of our children are being brought into the learning process. We can debate quality, all those nice things, but that is another issue. For now, they are going to school. The very next slide is a little less encouraging, but it's still important so that we learn to work with data. The next slide talks about, of those who enrolled, how many finish? So we've recruited, you remember the previous slide, very many. Over the same period, of those who enrolled in 1970, about 62% completed primary school. By 2015, that number had slowly, it's like a slow death, it's just declining slowly declined from I think the peak was somewhere around 65 in 2004, 2003. That number has declined to about 55%. Primary school enrollment completion. That means our children are going to school, but for a number of reasons are not able to complete their studies. You and I, as leaders with a growing burden for our continent, have to ask ourselves, why? Why? Can anything be done about anything? Is this our fate? Do we roll over and die at this point? There is more. Global child mortality. Again, these are global numbers. They are global statistics. They are measured with fair amount of accuracy across the world, and they are generally accepted as being a fair reflection of where the different countries are. Remember, we're looking at Africa. Please don't look at anybody badly. No, we're looking at the continent. Global child mortality is measuring how many children die for every 1,000 that are born, and they are graded from red to green. Red is in the center of Africa. Our children are dying. Uganda is massively exempted from this story. So some incredible work is happening in Uganda that is not happening in other countries around us. Are you seeing this slide? Come on, somebody, talk to me.
Yes,
Yes,
we
we
see
are.
it.
There is something happening in Uganda, and this is where, as leaders, you must explore further and say, who are those people in charge? What are they doing differently? They're in a region with scarce resources, but they are able to do something with their scarce resources that the neighbors can't do. We may not be as glamorous as the other countries are further measuring. Are our mothers dying? How many are dying? Again, the story here is not a good one. Africa as a whole struggles compared with the rest of the world. But within the African story, Uganda is positive. From my view, as an observer of these things, it tells me that there are some things being done in the ministry that are good compared to our peers. Even Kenya doesn't match us in maternal mortality. World population, we've dealt with this one, but it is worth repeating. This is the annual number of births, world region. This is a beautiful wave, but and a lot can be said. I'll limit my comments to the blue one, Africa. That is the second one from the bottom. You will see that in 1950, that blue line was fairly thin. By 2019, that blue line is fairly thick. It's almost 3 to 4 times the size of the 1950 story. What that means for you and me is that we must understand that Africa as a continent is growing at a rate faster than any other continent in the world. I will repeat that. It is incumbent on every potential Oxide to know that Africa as a continent is growing at a rate, her population is growing at a rate faster than any other continent in the world. That has its benefits, it also has its weaknesses. Those who argue benefits, and I am in their number, is that this gives us an incredible, what they call a population boom. A population, there's a better phrase. It's an incredible harvest of talent, of energy, of vitality. But to harvest it requires leadership. It doesn't organize itself. Those who argue against it say these Africans are overwhelming us. There are too many. There are mouths to feed, there is aid to be given. These are just problems multiplying in front of us. And it's a very strong lobby globally. And they have organizations that push that agenda. They've done it with India, largely failed, and they're now on Africa. That's a story for another day. It's going to take a lot of time. But suffice to know that you belong to a continent where the numbers are exploding. Let's drill a little bit. Maybe I'll not spend time on this, but let me quickly point out that the most important aspect on this slide about population is urbanization. I'll not even get into it. It can take quite a bit of time. It's very, very entertaining. In your own free time, slowly read it. You will enjoy it. But the gist of it that I'll draw out for you and me to reflect on is that our populations, people are no longer happy in the village. They've had enough of the village. They are saying, no, we also want to be in town. You're not going to enjoy electricity on your own. We are there with you. We want to ride borders in your midst. We don't want to hear stories on Christmas Day alone. No. Urban centers are exploding. The future belongs to cities. Those of you who are in policy making, those of you who are developing in that direction, you need to help us unpack this thing. What do the cities of the future look like? Uganda is going to be concentrated around urban centers. Are we ready? An urban center is not an urban center because we call it a city. Story for another day. I'll stick to the main point. The main point is we have left the rural way of life. It's a global phenomenon and it is very exaggerated in Africa. Are you and I as leaders ready for that reality? What does it mean for crop production? What does it mean for social cohesion? Those of you who are in politics, what does it mean for organizing votes in the city? What does it mean for the psyche of the young people? What does it mean? It changes the dynamic of leadership. These things don't fall out of the sky. These are things, are trends that develop right under our noses, and if we care to pay attention, we will identify them for what they are. INT class of number 29, please remember that the most profound effect in the next couple of years is going to be urbanization, accelerated rural-urban migration. Life expectancy, after your exercise on population.io, this will be a very easy slide for you and me to read. Suffice to say that all is not doom and gloom. On the continent, as a general rule, life expectancy is going up. So you and I can expect to live longer. I got onto population.io in preparation for this class, and I was pleasantly surprised to see that statistically, if I stay in Uganda, I can reasonably expect to live to 75 years old. I'm 46 today. That is the statistic modeling. Now, I have not yet added faith. I have not yet added good eating habits. I have not yet added running every day. Sure, you might endure me for another couple of years yet. Good news. So there is positivity. There are some things that we are doing right. Can we take honest stock of them, do them better? Can we take stock of the things that are not working and address them? This World Bank is a very interesting bank. I have mixed feelings about them, but we don't have time to get into that. But there are some things that they say that are incredibly perceptive. Incredibly perceptive. Listen to this. A typical African today is a rural girl who is 19.7 years old, 20 years old. I'll say that one more time. A typical African today is a rural girl who is 19.7 years old. We are a very young continent. What does that mean? Why is that statement even being made? Ladies and gentlemen, may I suggest to you two things, and I'm sure you will draw out many more. Number one, what that means is that, sir, madam, if you're a leader, if your decisions are not affecting and impacting a 20-year-old rural girl, you're wasting all our time. If you do not have, wasting all our time. Number two, what I suggest to this class that this means is that we must understand that if we do not harness the creativity and ability of this 20-year-old girl as a continent, we have no future. What do they mean by typical? It's the median number. If you put Africans on a line, all of us, as if we are voting in an LC1 election, and you go to the middle, you will land on a 20-year-old African girl. But there is news. In Uganda, that number is 17 years, 16.7, those of you who are mathematically inclined. How do you formulate policies for a 16-year-old? I have a daughter who is 16 here. That's the person you leaders must be solving for on a daily. It's not how many trips you can collect in a year to finish roofing your house. That may not be the imperative. If you're going to be effective, if you're going to be associated with INT, you're going to think. You're going to get creative. You're going to learn. You're going to learn from others. You're going to research. You're going to be the best version of yourself and bring to the table something that will change the life of this 16-year-old rural girl. Let's go macro one more time. The global community, Uganda inclusive, maintains something called the Human Development Index. What this does is a measure of well-being of people in every country. Very interesting measures: life expectancy, quality of education, reasonable access to a good living, and so on and so following. You can knock yourself out on the variables. But at the end of the day, they put everything in a pot, boil it, and come out with some colors. The colors are in front of you. The darker the shade, the better the performance of that country. The lighter the shade, the weaker the performance of that country. In very simple terms, Africa is the weakest continent in the world in Human Development Index terms. It means we are not doing enough to improve the well-being of our people. Let me throw in the L word. It means we leaders are not doing enough to improve the well-being of our people. I was reading the 2021 report. It is fascinating. They spend too much time, in my view, they spend too much time on the environmental issues, climate change, and so on. In my view, they spend too much time on that. But if you get to the middle and the bottom, you will begin to see the good old-fashioned metrics where we significantly underperform and we are comfortable with how things are. These are not things of 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 10 decades, not 2 decades. These are things that have developed over time. Remember, we're trying to ask ourselves, over the last 60 years, are we progressing? Are we not progressing? That's the question. And we're just looking at facts as they are and attempting an impartial analysis. And we really encourage each one of you to please do so for yourselves. Woo, this one tends to be controversial, but I could not resist putting it in there. They used to call it the Failed States Index. I'm sure some people made a lot of noise. They've now changed the language. They are called the Fragility in the World Index. Fragility States Index. So they don't want to call them failed states. They just want to say, things in this nation are not very good. And they played with the colors. 4 years ago, they had a really nice monochrome, which was easy to read. This time they played with the colors, but the table below, I think, helps all of us. There's a small key down there where it shows blue means the state is very sustainable. Green, stable. Yellow is a warning, things are about to get bad. Red is full alert. Africa as a continent generally is the most fragile part of the world. Again, they measure very many indexes to get to this conclusion. Very interesting reading. And they're getting better. They're getting better at reading and accuracy. They're getting much better. Again, Uganda, though doing poorly, we are in the alert zone, but we are not at the very bottom. You know, we have Congo to look to, we have South Sudan, we have Ethiopia to think, Somalia to think about. If anything, our troops are there helping them. So there are a couple of people behind us, but we're not exactly transformational. We're not exactly transformational. So we are considered fragile states by a whole host of entities. I looked at least 4. I read 3. 3 different entities came to the same conclusion. I personally have no problem with that conclusion. I think it's a fair representation. We are on the home stretch, and it is impossible to do a reflection on Africa in these times without reflecting on the impact of the COVID pandemic on our continent. What you have before you is the best data map I could find on the spread of the coronavirus, and in particular, mapping the deaths per country. This particular one is owned by the Johns Hopkins University. And this is one graph where I think Africa is really doing well. The deeper the red, the more people that have died from COVID and has been reported as a COVID death. Let's not argue about accuracy. That one, we can get lost there. Let's work with what we have. What this particular slide is showing, what this map shows, is that on the African continent, it has been least affected as a continent than any other part. Okay, Australia, I don't know if we can really talk about it, but okay, if you want to argue, Australia stands out. But Africa, as a populated continent pushing 1 billion people, has had minimal impact of COVID. I know in Uganda, this is a difficult statement because we are just beginning to emerge out of a very bad wave. And many of us, even on this call, have lost very close people. But it might surprise us, and some people already know this, to know that Africa, generally, we have been spared the worst of this thing. So this is something to be grateful for. My only question is it because of good leadership? Don't tell me leadership of intercessory prayer. We will have another session on the side. Is it because of good leadership? Can we look and say, yes, this is effective policy making that is driving this kind of performance on the African continent? Or are there factors that are not easy to reduce to a slide that are sparing us the worst of this plague? This is the reality as of this morning. And this is the world that we live in. I would like to conclude to allow for questions and comments by encouraging each and every one of us to understand that things don't just happen. When you join INT, your eyes begin to see. For many of you, you already saw, but maybe you're entering a community of people who see like you, and you can begin to have discussions and conversations on what can be done. If you and I are not engaged in a process that is improving the situation, we have no right to say anything. It's quite simple. And I think each person is called uniquely. Each one of you is called uniquely. My hope and my personal prayer for each one of you is that you will find your place. You will apply yourself and you will make a contribution. 2 books to recommend. We have a book by Dr. James Magara, who chairs INT and has been instrumental from the very beginning. He's the one who actually invited me into this process many, many years ago. He wrote a book on positioning Africa for the 21st century, where he makes an argument for the importance of think tanks. Think tanks, I like the phrase because it kind of forces you to think. If you and I are not thinking, then we are fumbling our way through life. You must be intentional and you must think. So he makes the argument in that book. This is recommended reading. Dead Aid is another book. Harriet, you need to correct me whether this is recommended or it's moved into the core curriculum now. Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo. Fantastic book. I think it's the one that really brought her to fame. She had written 1 or 2 before this. And she makes the argument that this business of giving aid to Africa is a bad idea. It might shock some of you, but she argues that aid is really bad. She argues it leads to dependency, it encourages corruption, and so on. Nothing changes because of aid. And aid, at the end of the day, serves the interests of the people that give the aid. It's a well-oiled machine. She makes a pretty good argument. She took a lot of heat for it. I think it was President Kagame that came to her rescue. So these are books that will enlarge your thinking, that will deepen your understanding. And please make the time for the core curriculum books and make sure you add this as well in your reading diet. It will bring you to a place of greater understanding and more effectiveness. With that, I will hand it over to Kathy for questions and comments, and hope and pray that something in you is stirred up to do something about this continent that you and I call home. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you. Alice, I see you're ready to speak, so you can go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Very, very, very thought-provoking, very unsettling as well. And really, as you said at the beginning, this either pushes you to think differently. If it doesn't, then I guess we just need to question what makes us that you don't just cry out for Africa, for Uganda. Yeah, something shifts in you from you speaking. Something shifts in you. I'd wanted to ask earlier. When you dropped off the first time, you were speaking of something that was quite interesting, and I'd wanted you to pick up on it. It was on colonization and what was the state, of events before colonization. What led to massive colonization? Let alone, yes, there were lords that were ready to ferry people and sell them away. But really, what led to that? What was that state that forced Africa to be colonized at the extent that it was colonized and for a long period of time, and we're still struggling to come out of it?
Patrick, I'll let you respond to each question.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Alice, for that question. That is it's a broad one, but I will attempt an answer for you. The slide at which the connection cut was the Berlin conference. And what I was going to get into, and I can summarize for you now, is that the colonial powers they were better at identifying their interests, their strategic interests, and they were better at executing their plans. Our forefathers, without being disrespectful, I think struggled to navigate and negotiate that balance of power. I think I was able to give one example, which really, it irritates me to no end, which is why I talk about it a lot. Tipu Tipu's example, he was exceptionally skilled, but he deployed his skills against the continent and he made a lot of money. He was extremely wealthy. If those of you who visited Zanzibar, you can visit his home. You can visit the port where he executed a lot of his transactions, the markets where he sold his slaves and so on. Those kinds of people, I think, begin to give us insight into what was the prevailing situation on the continent for the colonial powers to be successful in executing their agenda. Remember, at nation state level, everybody acts in self-interest. It is one of the most glaring things of geopolitics that you come to realize. Every nation state acts in its self-interest. That's what drives them. When somebody walks into your home and says they want to feed you for the next 3 months, I think it is fair to ask why. What motivates you to cross the lake or the river to come to my house and say you're going to feed my family for the next 3 months? It is fair to understand. And with the benefit of time, those of us who have come many years later, we have the benefit of hindsight. We can then see that a lot of the methods they deployed, whether it was religion, whether it was commerce, whether it was military partnerships, all of it drove one agenda, and that was domination. And as nation states in Africa, we were ineffective in negotiating that power equation. I'll add one thing, that in present times, we have the same struggle. In my opinion, we have the same struggle because we see, again, I'll talk in broad terms, we see the decline of the West beginning to happen in our lifetime, and we see the rise of the East. The West embodied by the US, the East largely embodied by China. And as those global powers shift, nations like ours must find our place. And it's a negotiation. The ones who are best at it will be able to be effective in implementing their future. For the most part, nations do not invest in the time required to execute those plans. So we were not good at that. And there are many examples we can get into, but that was the prevailing environment. And slowly over time, we kept losing ground, whether it was the kingdoms or the nations as they were birthed, and even post-colonial experience. We've been significantly dominated over the last 60 years. And that needs to change. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Patrick. Anyone else?
Yes, Kathy. Sorry, I didn't put up my hand earlier.
Okay, sorry.
Okay,
I'll go after. I'll go after.
I'll have Wycliffe and then Flower, but I'm going to request that you keep it to just the question because we have just about 5 minutes. Wycliffe, please.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Patrick. Quite an intriguing. My interest is so much in this line of discussion, and I think I'll look up for you going forward. We are still here together. But my question is, and this is where I have, of course, for everyone, maybe we can get comments. I think, isn't it true that what has failed Africa is the failure to embrace diversity in our cultural settings, so that then we can, you see, what the colonialists did is they brought us together at the time we were not ready. And then they left us there without training us. Now, like, for example, the states, what we call states in Africa, are not actually states. It's a bundled up group like Uganda. You look at Uganda had its own countries or states like Buganda, Bunyoro, and some of, the question is, isn't it this time that we embrace that, take that line and first try to make people understand what it means and then bring them together to form the Uganda or the bigger Africa? Because Africa is so diverse that bringing it together to make one market before people understanding the importance of coming together socially seems to be a very, very uphill task. What's your view on that?
Thank you, Wycliffe. Patrick will take the two so that you summarize. Flower, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm reflecting on your statement of when someone crosses the road and says, I'll feed you for 3 years or 3 days. You should ask why. Unfortunately, the same thing is happening. Before we said the colonialists did it, but even our own leaders are doing the same. When someone does something, you have to first reflect and wonder why. In your view, what has failed us as a nation or as a continent to tip the scale? Why are we still, even as in our small leadership, whether at the nation, whether at the communities, we are still doing the same? What has failed us as a nation or as a continent to tip the scale?
Whoa, thank you both. Really, really, really well thought out questions and really heavy questions. I can only make a contribution. And Wycliffe, I'll get to yours. Let me attempt a response to the second one. I am amazed. I'll preface it with a comment, then I'll get to the question. I am amazed. I've been extremely fortunate to travel widely. And I am amazed at the quality of Ugandans I find everywhere in the world. It is shocking. Did you know that the person in charge of infrastructure in South Africa, road infrastructure, is a Ugandan? They are begging him to marry a South African woman. He's been there for a number of years, and on, and I'm sure you people have similar stories. But somehow, when we are expressed as a nation, when we are expressed as a continent, we are what we see. So the question I think you're asking is why? My reflection, I'll limit it to one. And I hope it doesn't sound like a cop-out, but I'll limit it to one. I'll simply say leadership. I'll say leadership. Because when leadership is effective, and in your next lecture, you're going to get into some very, very interesting material that will begin to unpack what I could not do in this time. When leadership is effective, it can take the worst possible situation and turn it and make it an incredible situation. And when your raw material is the kind of quality that we see on the continent, as individuals, but somehow expressed as a nation, it is quite interesting. Yeah, I think that's what it boils down to. That would be my contribution, with full respect that there are other voices in that space. Asks a question regarding, it's somehow related but it's different, about how we got together as nations. Were we not premature in our forming as a nation? I think that's the heart of what you're saying. My sense is, no, I don't think we were premature, but I think the work of formation has not ended. I don't think we are premature in being formed as a nation. If I look at nations all over the world, they go through a similar process. But for some reason, with us, we've struggled to settle the things that make us Africans, the things that make us Ugandans, so that I identify first as a Ugandan, and then only later as an Alur, and then only later as a Muganda, or whatever the tribe is. So I think the work is ongoing and needs to continue. That's why leaders have a huge task to bring people together. Dividing is so easy, and you've got a lecture coming up on Dreams of Our Founding Fathers, where you will explore this even more. You will see the role of tribe on the continent. It's unbelievable. It's like a bad movie that you keep watching every few years. I've seen this movie before, but I have to sit through it. I have seen this movie, but I have to sit through it. Why? Because it's easy to divide. It's very easy. Bringing people together, that's the work. And make them believe and make us all know that we have a stake in this thing. That's the work that you and I have to do. So with that, I thank you for giving me a hearing, and I hand it back to Kathy.